activities, to engage functionally in everyday activities. It can impact interactions and relationships, and it can absolutely create restrictions. And what that leads to is a decline in overall quality of life. We often see people who are engaged in challenging behaviour, they contact punishment much more frequently. They're isolated, and that can then lead to overall decline in your health and well-being. Challenging behaviour that's unmanaged and is unsafe can have a direct impact on somebody's health. And also it can create a barrier to access crucial health and medical services. So, we have some big reasons for talking about this.
Now, I'm sure we're all very aware that when it talks about the impact on the individual, we're also talking about the impact on those around them that are caring and teaching that individual. And that could be teachers, allied health, parents, siblings, and even, an employer, for example. So I might just go through quickly the impact on those around them. Let's look at teachers in schools. Now, our goal as teachers is to help children with their social, their well-being. We want to sort of build resilient kids, but we also want them to access the curriculum. Now, behaviour can be a significant barrier in helping children get those kinds of outcomes. And it really puts a lot of stress and pressure on school systems. So if you're looking at teachers, one thing that we see in practice, but also with the research, is that it leads to a lot of things like teacher burnout, and is actually the biggest key for teachers leaving the profession. So really highlights why we need to sort of spend some time there. In addition to teachers, if we look at parents, carers, siblings, the family unit, they feel isolated too. It restricts that family unit accessing community settings. They might actually feel like they get a bit of rejection from their community. Other people in the school might be talking about them. And we know that so often parents feel fatigued and they can't cope. The last sort of group to sort of flag is that allied health and medical professionals who, their job is to help children access intervention and medical services. What we've seen happen, and it's a shame, but what we've seen happening with challenging behaviour is it really creates a barrier for them into actually accessing those services. We see children being withdrawn from services or being told, we need to stop this service for now. You need to focus on a behaviour support plan and then come back to us. And we just really want to move away from that.
So we're going to use this graphic to weigh up an important point when it comes to behaviour change. So often when we're met with challenging behaviour, when we're dealing with challenging behaviour, whether it's in our classroom, at home or out in the community, we go for that quick fix approach. We go for that magic bullet trick that we think is just going to get rid of this behaviour. And often when we use those quick fix approaches, we can see sometimes a fast and dramatic stop to that behaviour. But this rarely leads to lasting change. And what we're after when it comes to positive behaviour support practices is meaningful and lasting change. And so if we look at this graphic, we can see on one side we've got the quick fix approach, and on the other side we've got the meaningful and lasting change approach. And you can see which one weighs more. And that's because meaningful and lasting change approach isn't the easy way, it isn't the fast way, there's more involved. And so it is a heavier approach to use, but we're going to ensure that we get that positive change that will hopefully last the test of time. So with a quick fix approach, it's often that Band-Aid approach. We put the Band-Aid on, but we're not really dealing with what's underneath. It's often just managing risk, just putting something in place so that it doesn't get any worse. And we're often guessing here. It's a lot of guesswork, and this leads us to becoming quite reactive very often because we're working in the dark. We haven't really done any groundwork to determine what is actually going on for this individual. Whereas when we're looking for more meaningful and lasting change, we always start with some sort of assessment of function. Now, in a more comprehensive approach, we'd be looking at conducting a functional behaviour assessment. But we can also use our function-based thinking here as well, and we're going to spend a bit of time talking about that tonight. We look at data collection and using data to inform decisions, but also to help inform interventions as well. someone's got their microphone on, and training. So training is a critical part here. If we're expecting people to implement positive behaviour support plans effectively and consistently, we need to spend time training everybody involved, making sure that they know how to implement the plan, implement the strategies at the right times. And finally, the most important component of this side of the scale, and our favourite, is it involves teaching. And when people ask Jill and I, you know, what do you spend most of your time doing as a behaviour therapist? Our answer is we spend most of our time teaching, because when it comes to positive behaviour change, our most effective, crucial thing that we can impart on somebody else is teaching them new, more appropriate behaviour that they can generalise and use across many different settings. And that's our ultimate goal.
So before we kind of dive into what a function-based approach looks like, which is sort of where we're moving towards, it is worth just spending a bit of time talking about the past approaches to behaviour support. And I say the word past a little bit loosely here because when challenging behaviour occurs and we're fatigued and we're tired and we're burnt out, we sometimes slip into old habits, which we would hope to see as a past approach. So by flagging these now and early on, what we're hoping we can do is sort of signal to you when we're falling into those pitfalls and going, that really is a past approach. How can I move forward? So the first one is a very reactive and consequence-based approach. And that's really where we see behaviours escalating and we step in at crisis point and we put in intervention plans, particularly crisis intervention plans that look at hoping to de-escalate things quickly and make that person safe. The next step we would often look at is kind of lends itself to this, but is short-term focus intervention. So again, it often happens around crisis point. We look at, okay, what do we need to do? We need to get more supports into the classroom. We need to get access to an allied health professional, such as an OT or a speech. We need the psychologist to come into the school. And we put a lot of focus for short-term focus in place. And there's a few issues with this. The first one is while we might be able to de-escalate things at crisis point with a short-term plan, we also know that behaviours do pop up again very quickly. Secondly is we don't build capacity for those teachers or whoever's working, the family unit, for example, to handle situations like that again in the future with that student or potentially with other students as well. So we're not building the capacity of the sector. The next one we look at is a topographical approach to behaviour. This is where we go, okay, so this behaviour looks like this, let's call it a tantrum. And the best intervention to put in place is this, because that's what you do when children have a tantrum. So examples like, you know what, if you are aggressive in the classroom, you are put on, you're suspension is the consequence to that. Or you might go, oh, look, you're calling out in class, I'm putting you on the red traffic light system. That's very much looking at what behaviour looks like and matching intervention accordingly, not at why the child's engaging in that challenging behaviour. The next one we look at is diagnosis blaming. And it's worth noting here because when children engage in challenging behaviour, we sort of start looking down the, okay, if they don't have a diagnosis, should they go and get one? Now, for those of you that have experienced this, we all know that getting a diagnosis is not such a simple process. It takes time. And what we're trying to say now is don't wait for a diagnosis to put intervention in place. Act earlier. The other thing that happens with children who may have a diagnosis and we get into this diagnosis blaming is that we link behaviour to the diagnosis. So if I said something to you like, oh, Johnny, he runs around a lot in class because of his ADHD. So why does Johnny move around a lot in class? Well, because he has ADHD. Okay, so what are we going to do about that? What's the intervention around that? And it, by using sort of diagnosis blaming, we're saying the problem is within the child and it's because of their diagnosis. And what we think is really important is to sort of empower us to look at the environment. The environment is what we can change. That's our tools that we can sort of manipulate to support that student's learning and behaviour. And that sits outside the person. The other thing is we get into this bit of a circular reasoning trap where we kind of blame the behaviour to the disability or the diagnosis and we go back and forth and back and forth. The last thing we want to talk about here is generic interventions. And these are like really clever cookie cutter approaches. Someone's come up with a really clever idea. It's kind of, gone across different schools and we kind of see it whitewashed across schools. One that comes to mind is the traffic light system. I know that my kids have experienced traffic light system in school, and they make up 80% of the kids in class that respond super well to that. They really want to stay on green, and if they go on orange, they work really hard to get back down to green again. But when we're talking about children with behaviours of concern, those sorts of interventions don't tend to work very well for them. They need to be individualised, because those kids, we can see them going up and down that traffic light, or spending a lot of time on red. So generic interventions for kids at that tier 2 and tier 3 level really don't sort of fit for them. They need to be individualised.
So we're spending a bit of time tonight talking about the foundations, and we think that this is really important because we want to, I guess, build a bit of a base knowledge of where a function-based approach comes from. And we can do that by looking at some of the basic assumptions of behaviour. So, one is that almost all behaviour, particularly the behaviour that we're interested in, is learned. And it's important for us to recognise that it is within everybody's capacity to change their behaviour given the right circumstances and the right conditions. And the way in which we try to do that is by looking for what purpose their behaviour serves. And this can be individual to everybody. The same behaviour can have many different functions for different people. And the way in which we start to uncover these reasons is by looking to the environment. And we're constantly assessing the interaction between the individual's behaviour and their environment. The other thing that, our belief system is based on, our scientific belief system is based on around behaviour, is that learning involves behaviour change. Learning is not passive. It's not something that just happens to us. It involves observable changes in behaviour, and it's due to our experience. So we kind of look back at our learning history to make predictions about moving forward. And this becomes really important when we're looking at an individual's behavioural repertoire. And finally, behaviour has a function. And this is something that our function-based approaches are trying to help us determine. Knowing that function will lead us to interventions. So the science of behaviour tells us that behaviour is lawful and orderly and predictable, even though it doesn't feel like this sometimes. Sometimes we can just think that, that tantrum just happened out of the blue, or, I don't know why that this occurred. It's just occurring for no reason. Actually not the case. We can use our tools of looking towards the environment, looking at an individual's learning history, and start to make predictions. And this helps us to become more predictable and put plans in place for future occurrence.
I can see lots of chat happening in the chat box, which is really great to see. And definitely, if there's any questions or comments, we're definitely going to allow some time towards the end. And I saw one thing that Jess posted about, behaviour as communication. And we believe that too, that behaviour serves a purpose for that person. And that might be that they're trying to communicate something. They haven't found an effective way to communicate it, so they're using behaviour to do so. So I sort of see some chats happening, which is really exciting. So we've been saying the word behaviour for a while now, and worth stopping here and really talking about what is behaviour anyway. Because if I say to you behaviour, I reckon all of you are sitting there going, challenging behaviour, behaviours of concern, difficult behaviour, or bad behaviour. I might just put that loosely. So if I made a comment such as, Micaela, we've really got to talk about Ryder at school today and her behaviour. Automatically, Micaela's starting to conjure up sort of negative thoughts about what Ryder might have been doing. What we really want to talk about when we talk about behaviour is it's something observable and measurable. It's anything a person says or does. So it could be things like talking or being able to finish a task assigned to them. It could be, approaching a peers and saying hi to them. All those things are observable and are classified as behaviour. Just some of them are more appropriate and some of them are behaviours of concern. It always involves some sort of movement or action. And as Micaela said, it has a direct relationship with the environment. Something in the environment triggers that behaviour. Something in the environment is maintaining that behaviour. One point here is that when we talk about thoughts or feelings, we call them private events. And the reason we call them private events is only that person that's thinking and feeling those things can actually observe and measure them. So we sort of say that's within the skin, absolutely behaviour. It's something that only that person can identify.
So we're going to give you a minute to have a quick skim over these quotes that we've got up here, because it's important for us to make the distinction of when does behaviour become challenging? When would we determine it a behaviour of concern? So have a quick read, just give you a few seconds. Okay, so the quotes here provide some insight into when a behaviour might become challenging. And I guess it's important for us to note that the term challenging really should be looked at in terms of the social context, not as a specific label for that individual. It's not to do with a symptom of that individual's diagnosis or personality or anything like that. It's actually about that they're engaging in behaviour that challenges us, that challenges them, that challenges the environment. And we also need to look at other elements of behaviour to determine if it's challenging or not. And again, this would be individualised to each individual and the context they're in. So one of the things we look at are certain dimensions of behaviour. So things like intensity, frequency, duration, and whether or not those dimensions of behaviour mean that this particular behaviour is becoming challenging. So if you consider a young child that's saying no a lot, for example, but a young child that's saying no a lot and they're refusing, would we consider this to be particularly challenging behaviour that needs a comprehensive intervention plan? Probably not. Young children say no a lot and refuse to do things a lot. However, if we do have a young child that's engaging in these behaviours at such an intensity and frequency that it's beginning to threaten their quality of life. So, for example, they're beginning to say no to safety concerns. So refusing to wear a seatbelt in the car, perhaps refusing to eat food, refusing to hold their parent's hand when they cross a road, refusing to brush their teeth, things that could have a health or safety impact, then perhaps we would start to look at that behaviour as challenging. Finally, the other area we look at is context. Now, context plays a really important role in determining whether a behaviour is quite expected and appropriate or whether, in fact, it's challenging. So thinking about a young child, say, sleeping in their parents' bed, young or an older child sleeping in their parents' bed, you've got to put them to bed at night, they get up at some point and creep into mum and dad's bed and they spend the rest of the night there. Now, in some families, this would be totally culturally and socially appropriate.
Not a problem in my house, and almost encouraged.
And in fact, encouraged and welcomed. In my house, not so much. So, in other families, perhaps that poses a challenge. It becomes something that family wishes to work on and change. And so context is really important.
So I'm not sure if anyone has seen this iceberg analogy used to talk about the influencing factors of behaviour, but we really like this one. So when we look at an iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, what's above the water, is the behaviours that we can see and observe and measure. That's sort of the behaviour of concern. That's that challenging behaviour. What we do know, just like an iceberg, which is kilometres under the water, there is a lot of influencing factors that are at play, which sort of bring about that challenging behaviour and bring it to the surface. And part of doing an assessment, particularly a functional behaviour assessment, is looking at diving under that water and starting to determine what variables are at play, what's happening for this individual, and what's sort of bringing about and helping that behaviour rise. That could be a range of things such as the child's skill level. It might look at their environment. It might look at what's happening at home. It might be, that the child hasn't been eating particularly well for a while. So we're going to do a little bit of an activity with you here, an activity that we do in one of our workshops, and it's about talking about a little boy called Abdul. So I'm going to give you some statements about Abdul. If I read something out to you and you think, oh, that's definitely a behaviour that you could observe and measure, it's a challenging behaviour, it's the tip of the iceberg, put your hand on your head. Okay? Now, if I'm telling you something, you're like, oh, that's probably an influencing factor. That's under the water. I'm going to get you to cross your arms. Now, if you have your cameras on, that's great, because then we can see you all get involved and do this. Now, if you don't, all good. Micaela's actually going to model, hopefully, the correct response here. Okay, so Abdul often runs away from class during maths lesson. What do you think? Yes, that's right. It's above the water. Thank you. Please do get involved. Let's get moving. What about Abdul has just started a new medication for anxiety. What do you think? Which one? Yes, that's Under the Water. Well done. I see some comments in the comment box too, which is absolutely great too. So Abdul grimaces and he snaps his pencil in half. What do you think? Yep, Above the Water. Excellent. Well done, everyone. Because you can see him do that, can't you? It's observable, it's measurable. And the last one is Abdul has a history of disrupted sleep. What do you think? Yeah, it's Below the Water. Very good. Excellent. So this actually takes us to function-based thinking, behaviour. Sorry, here we go.
We're finally here. So we're gonna start talking about a function-based approach. So you've heard us talk about the function of behaviour, and this is the why. This is not just about that tip of the iceberg. It's not just about what behaviour looks like. It's about determining what purpose this serves for the individual. It's determining the consequences, because it's the consequences that control that behaviour and lead us to the function. So a function-based approach is about using that information to guide us to intervention and matching intervention to that individual's function or purpose of their behaviours. So research tells us that interventions that are designed on the basis of a functional behaviour assessment have far greater effect at reducing behaviours of concern. And what we ultimately want to do is to use the intervention to teach the individual more appropriate behaviour that serves the same purpose. So it really is all about really being compassionate and thinking about what is it that this person is needing or wanting or looking for, and giving them alternative, more appropriate ways to get that need.
So what this takes us now is to our two methodologies that sort of inform our practice. And that's ABA, Applied Behavioural Analysis, and Positive Behaviour Support, or PBS. Now, ABA is where the function-based approach comes from. I saw a little comment before about confusion around ABA versus function-based assessment. Function-based assessment is an assessment tool used within ABA, but it's now kind of moved into the PBS world too, which is fabulous. So let me get through it a bit more. So what is ABA? It's a systematic approach to the assessment and the evaluation of behaviours. This is where we get our robust, empirically validated principles and procedures that we can use to support our children's behaviour, but also their learning. So ABA is really focusing on improving socially significant behaviour and creating lasting and practical change. So ABA gives us that science. Now, if we move into PBS, it is actually derived from ABA, but it takes the science of ABA and it puts it within a much more complex system, such as a school environment. There's many more layers within a school environment that we need to be mindful of, and PBS works really well within that context. PBS looks at the whole school approach, creating a common language around behaviour support, looking at really making data-informed decisions around what to do to support a child's behaviour. It puts in place supports for children at all levels of behaviour support, so from the sort of tier 1 right up to tier 3. So while we highlight ABA and PBS as our go-to for function-based approaches, I do want to stress that these two methodologies are not opposed to other interventions and strategies. We do see them working really well. So when we're talking about things like sensory-based interventions, or we're looking at trauma-informed practice, what we say here is they can work well together. We kind of use that saying of they can actually be friends. What we try to encourage people to do early on, though, is use functional behaviour assessment or function-based thinking as the part of that assessment process that happens.
So before we move further, we're going to show you a video, and this is one of the videos that we would use in our teacher training course. And we want to make the point that these videos are contrived. So they're using actors or kids that we could find that were happy to get behind the camera, and they're contrived for the purposes of training. So they're there for skill-based practice. So they may come across a little artificial, but they're specifically to hone in on certain points so that we can use them for practice and training. So before we do this, we just need to swap over the sound. So give us a moment. I'm going to play it. Okay. Hopefully we're not getting feedback.
I just saw a comment here saying, have you been filming my classroom? That makes me really happy, actually, because all the video footage that we use in our workshops, we are actually very, we've sort of put all the things that we've seen in action into little snippets and made videos of them. So yes, I'm glad.
And so we use this video for a particular reason. And after watching it, I want you to ask yourself, do I get a lot of information from this video? Do I get a lot of information to help me make decisions about what's happening for this young girl? And the answer is likely no. And that's because this video depicts very clearly the tip of the iceberg. It depicts what she's doing. We could create a really great observable and measurable definition of her behaviour, which is important. We could really clearly describe the form of the behaviour. And someone's made a comment.
Well done.
Kristen, we don't know the antecedent. Absolutely. We don't have any information about the before or the after. There's no other environmental factors that are highlighted in this, and that's not going to lead us down a path to determining what's happening for her and what we can do about it. And so that's just quite often we get stuck. This is the thing, stuck on that tip of the iceberg. You know, we're really focused on what the behaviour looks like and what's happening. We don't look at all, you know, the stuff under the water and the stuff around the environment.
This sort of lends its sort of great segue into talking about the ABC model. Some of you will be familiar with this. I can see one person already mentioned the antecedent, which is brilliant. So what we do know is that behaviour does not occur in a vacuum. It occurs in what we call a contingency, a three-term contingency. And behaviour always starts with an antecedent. Something in the environment triggers the response. It could be something that someone does or says. So something triggers the response, which is the antecedent. And then when you look at consequence, some response to that behavior. So it could be the response of another person or their peers or their sibling. It could be a change in the environment. So when we look at behavior, something's always triggering it, which is the antecedent. There's always a consequence that's maintaining that behavior and potentially strengthening it over time. Now, the reason we sort of really focus on this model as our go-to is because when we're talking about putting intervention plans in place, the actual behavior you can't do very much about. What you can do something about is within your control, and as part of that environment is your antecedents and your consequences. So we can really put interventions in place that look at the antecedents, preventing, and the consequences about responding to behavior. That's what your power is. That's what you can manage.
So we're going to have a really quick look at what actually is a functional behaviour assessment, or an FBA. That's, we usually hear the term FBA. And an FBA is a process. It's not a thing. It's not this sort of, you know, neat little packaged up tool that you can just take and pick up and use. It's actually a complex set of procedures, and it's a problem-solving process, actually. And what it does, it helps us analyse that contingency, that ABC contingency, determine the relationship between an individual's behaviour and their environment. And the important point to make is that when we do an FBA, we're only ever working with a hypothesis. We're never working with a defined 100% absolute function. And this is actually a good thing, because it means that we can always go back, reassess, and make changes to plans. And this is the tool that can help us get to those effective interventions. So I guess what we also want to talk to you about tonight is function-based thinking, because functional behaviour assessment, it really is a complicated process. And in order to get others to implement an effective function-based process, it takes comprehensive training in every step of the process. And whilst, again, we think that's great and that's what we want to achieve, we want people to know that function-based thinking is a great first step. And function-based thinking is simply a systematic way of thinking about behaviour, which leads us to being proactive and function-based in our interventions as well. And there's 3 levels of thinking. We're going to go through each level.
So this function-based assessment, functional behaviour assessment and function-based thinking, they sound similar, they're a bit confusing, so it's just worth just stopping and just discriminating some of the key differences. So functional behaviour assessment is a scientific process. It requires training, assessment, data collection systems, analysis of that data, often done by a comprehensive team of clinicians. It's lengthy, it's intensive, and it's often used when behaviours are quite intense. So if you know the RTI model, we're really talking about students at that tier 2 and definitely at that tier 3 that require a functional behaviour assessment to guide the intervention plan. Now, the challenges that come with this is that we often work in a very limited capacity to actually do a functional behaviour assessment. So it really is sort of focusing on that tier 2 and tier 3 level kids. Now, the great thing about function-based thinking is it's a way of thinking. We believe it's in everyone's capacity, and it really lays a great foundation for functional behaviour assessment. If you can start thinking functionally about behaviour, you're already one step forward in conducting a functional behaviour assessment. You're on your way. And it really focuses on stepping in really early, being proactive, looking at putting preventative strategies in place, and focuses really on that teaching component. So what we'll do now is we'll just go through some key points about the 3 levels in function-based thinking.
Okay, so looking at level 1, this is all about the maintaining function. And this is really an investigative part of the thinking process. It's what we've been talking about in terms of trying to determine the purpose of that individual's behaviour. And this is where our ABC model is really crucial. We're looking at the antecedents and the consequences. So when we're looking at antecedents, we're looking for things like triggers. We're looking for those things that set the scene and make it more likely that challenging behaviour may or may not occur. And we're also looking at the consequences. So this is where we're looking at the outcomes of somebody's behaviour. What happens after they've engaged in that behaviour? The important point to make here is when we're making decisions about an individual's behaviour, we wouldn't just do this after one quick observation. It's about repeated observations and repeated measures. That's how we're going to build a story. That's how we're going to get some information that we can actually make some predictions from. Question to ask is, what is strengthening this behaviour? When we have a challenging behaviour that is on the increase or just continuing and we just can't seem to make a change, we know that something in the environment is strengthening it. And that's what we need to try and figure out. So we need to determine, is this individual typically successful in getting what they want or avoiding what they don't want as a result of their behaviour? That's going to lead us to the function. So we've got another one of our videos for you here. And before we do our little changeover with all the sound, when you watch this video, I want you to try your level 1 thinking. So try to think about that maintaining function. I know we've only got one little snippet here, just for practice. So think about that ABC model, and we'll start to see if we get a little bit more information. Okay, hopefully there's no feedback.
I have gymnastics for 2 hours, then I'm going to the beach.
2 hours?
Yeah, I do a lot of gymnastics.
Do you like it?
Yeah, I love it.
Oh.
Let's fight it!
Okay. Can I be in?
No. I got you. I'm not playing now. Stop it! I said I wasn't playing. Stop it.
What about?
I'm gonna get you. Push.
Sophia.
Ow.
Sophia, that's enough. Sophia, you need to calm down, all right? Sophia.
Okay, so another example of a video depicting a child engaging in potentially some challenging behaviour. This time, we hope you are looking at it with your ABCs in mind. Do we get a little bit more information from this video? Can we start thinking about the things that are in the environment that might be making it more likely for her to engage in that behaviour, or what sorts of outcomes she might be getting for that behaviour? These are the things that we want to start thinking about at this level 1 thinking. When we're thinking functionally about behaviour, we're essentially trying to look at, is this individual gaining access to desired things as a result of their behaviour, or are they escaping or avoiding less preferred and undesired things as a result of behaviour? Both of those outcomes, if they're successful, will serve to strengthen their behaviour. So the sorts of things that people might want to gain access to are things that we want to need, things like help and assistance, attention and interactions from others, actions from others. So potentially this young girl may be seeking interactions from others, but also specific actions, the game of chase, this particular game that she's wanting to play. People also might be trying to gain access to preferred sensory experiences. And on the other side, we can avoid or escape demanding and boring tasks, avoid or escape the attention or interaction from others, avoid or escape non-preferred sensory experiences, and also trying to avoid or escape specific locations and environments. Now, the complex thing is that behaviour isn't necessarily black and white. So one behaviour that looks the same might have many of these different functions. And likewise, one function could have many different behaviours attached to it. So this is why we do need to have some ways of thinking functionally about behaviour.
So while we spent level 1 on sort of investigating the functions of what's happening for the individual, level 2 thinking is still an investigation mode, but we're looking very much at skill-based investigation. So looking at what are the skills of in this individual? Are there particular skills of this little girl that you saw playing chase that perhaps she needs support in learning? Let's look at, for example, social skills. What kinds of social skills do you think you might have seen that she might need to start developing? Could be things such as, have a go in the chat box if you like, but it could be things as, yes, how to initiate play. For her to recognise who is playing the game and who is not playing the game, such as the children sitting on the bench. It might be things such as knowing how to respond when someone says, no, I don't want to play. It might be learning to take turns, exactly, well done, the rules of the game. Brilliant, you guys are on it. Those are all skills that we have to start assessing. Can she do this? Is it within her skill set, or is it something that she needs to learn? Now, the other side of it is it something she needs to be motivated to do instead? Because when we're looking at, yep, I see reading social cues. Yes, exactly. Reading nonverbal, body language as well, and knowing how to respond. So the thing about motivation is some of these skills she might have, but she's not motivated to use, or she finds it hard to use. So therefore she goes to the behavior instead that's much more effective. It gets that outcome really, really quickly. We also look at things such as adaptive behavior, which are everyday skills that kids need. That it could be self-help skills, it could be executive functioning skills, it could be communication skills, social skills, and those are things that sometimes sit outside the curriculum, but is very much so the school curriculum. But it's definitely something that these kids really need to learn. Definitely to learn in order to replace the problem behavior and give them a more appropriate way to get the same outcome that they wanted. So the big question we're asking here at level 2 is what's missing, what needs to be taught, and how do we do that? So just going along from that, when we look at what needs to be taught, we look at skills, we look at behavior deficits and behavior excesses, and I know for some of you, particularly, still for me, the word deficits, I kind of get a bit of a cringe, but this is how it's sort of put together in research, so I'll explain it. Behaviour deficits are things that kids have too little of. They're skills that they're lacking and they need more support to learn. As I said, play skills, communication skills, it could be fine motor skills, gross motor skills, academic skills, things that our kids have too little of. So we need to spend time building a bit of a learning profile here about how this person's learning and what skills they need support in developing. So these are things they have too little of. Behaviour excesses are behaviours they have too much of. So as Micaela said, all children say no, but when it's an excess, it's happening too often, then we know that that's a challenging behaviour and the behaviour is happening too often. So what we need to do here is tackle it from both directions. One, we've got to reduce the behaviour of concern by assessing, identifying the behaviour and creating a meaningful plan that works for the individual based on the function. Now, if that's all we do, we're missing this absolutely vital point, which is about the teaching side, which is the other side. So here we need to look at assessing their skill level. What does that child need to learn to get the same outcome? What desired behaviours do we want to see? And we need to identify those skills, think about how we're going to teach them, target the teaching, and then most importantly, motivate them to use those new skills instead. So it's a bit of a balancing act doing both of those.
So this brings us to thinking level 3, which is all about the intervention. Now you can see our ABC contingency here again, and you'll see right underneath it, we've got something that says prevent, replace, and respond. And you can see that that matches up beautifully to our ABC model. And that's because when we're looking at intervention, we need to ensure that a plan addresses the antecedent, the behaviour, and the consequence. So when we're addressing the antecedent, we're looking at modifying the environment before the behaviour occurs. They're our preventative strategies or our antecedent modification strategies. When we're looking at the consequence, we're looking at how do we react and respond appropriately and safely if and when the challenging behaviour does occur, but also how do we react and respond to the more appropriate behaviours that we're trying to get them to teach and use more often. And then finally, when we're looking at the behaviour, we're actually looking to teach an alternative behaviour. And the question we ask here is, what can this individual do instead? So we know that this challenging behaviour serves a purpose for them. What can they do instead in order to gain that same outcome? And we call this a replacement behaviour or a replacement skill. So part of our intervention is all about planning. So we're kind of moving away from that investigation standpoint now, and we're looking at a planning point. And so we want to plan against each of those areas of the contingency. We need our proactive and preventative strategies. We need to have a really solid plan in place for before the behaviour occurs. And it's amazing how much impact we can have by implementing things before the behaviour occurs and being proactive. We need to have our safe and appropriate responding strategies in place. We need to have our reinforcement system in place so that we have a way to reinforce and motivate our individual to engage in alternative behaviour. And we also need to have specific strategies to teach those new behaviours. Because as Jill sort of touched on before, we're either trying to establish completely new behaviour for an individual. They might not have these skills in their repertoire, or they might already have them, but we need to find a way to motivate them and get them to see a need to use them. And so if we think back to our student that we showed in the tipping game, and we think about intervention, the thinking level 3 intervention for her, we can sort of talk through some specific examples, I guess, in what we could do in this situation. And so there was many great ideas in the chat about some of those potential skill deficits around social skills that she may need to learn. So we were looking at things like how to initiate play appropriately, how to potentially take turns, how to play the rules of tipping appropriately, how to tip gently and safely in a way that other people will want to keep playing with you, what to do when your peer says, no, I don't want to play. Do I walk away? Do I find someone else to play? What about flexibility? Maybe I could play something that somebody else wants to play. In order to do this, sometimes we need to step away from the actual situation. Trying to teach in the moment is very, very hard because quite often we're just going to get an escalation to the behaviour. So we want to step away to a neutral time, and we want to do things like developing instruction and being really clear about the expectations of specific social skills. And then we want to use lots of modelling and rehearsal, ideally with people who she might want to play with. So we bring her peers into this instruction and modelling and rehearsal. She gets to model and rehearse with them in a neutral setting with lots of support, lots of reinforcement. And we might use additional supports depending on the student, like video modelling and social stories that assist with getting the expectations across. And then finally, we want to be able to generalise those new skills back to that environment. So back onto the playground, but we're ready. We're ready with our reinforcement system. We're ready with our special prompting techniques, and to support her appropriately in being able to generalise those skills back.
So this sort of takes us to our conclusion tonight. And whilst we've sort of really focused on a function-based approach and matching interventions to the why and what the purpose for the individual is, I do really want to stop and end this presentation on talking about critical skills to support appropriate behaviour. So many of our kids who have behaviours with concern have other skills they need to learn. And these are things such as, you know, can they actually wait for something that they really want to do? Can they make choices? Can they transition from a really highly preferred activity to a non-preferred activity? Can they gain attention appropriately? Can they ask for a break? Can they ask for help? So what's interesting here is that for lots of our kids, particularly in schools, these sorts of communicative acts and skills sit outside the curriculum, but boy, these kids really need to learn them. So we have to start asking ourselves, how can we teach these kids these skills? Because I bet you they're playing a big role in why behaviours are occurring for them.
So that actually concludes the webinar for this evening. We'll definitely go ahead and look through the chat and start answering some questions. We did want to bring your attention to what we've been working on here at MultiLit, and that's a comprehensive series in training for functional behaviour assessment. And we're actually launching our workshop 2 next week through a live webinar, and that's all about foundations assessment and measurement of behaviour. So it's really sort of taking the concepts that we've spoken about tonight, but more towards being able to conduct an effective school-based functional behaviour assessment.
And what we've done, and it's been a big focus for us, is as much as it is about skilling and building the capacity of the sector to conduct functional behaviour assessments, and we spend 9 hours on this workshop talking about how to do that, how to analyse data, take data, put intervention plans in place. And it's just on that assessment and measurement process. What we also do is we pair that up with the resources that you need to conduct that. So we know that one thing that teachers are is time poor. So what we've done is we've created an amazing database of assessment tools, data sheets, ways to analyse behaviour that will be yours and for you to implement within your classrooms. I'm just flicking through some of the references here so you can have a little bit of a look through those. But, Micaela and I love nothing more than chatting about this, which I hope you've picked up today. So if you wanted to get in touch with us, ask us some questions, or you're interested in what we're doing here at MultiLit with positive behaviour support, please send us an email. We're happy to set up a chat with you. And that concludes today. We might just stop for a second, have a look in the chat room, and feel free to ask any questions that you might have at this point, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Okay, Sue, feel free to put your mic on if you like, and if you want to ask a question.
Which email do we use?
Pardon?
Which email do we use? You said to email.
I'll flick back to the first slide because we've got our emails up there.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Oh, excellent. No, thank you.
There we go. Our emails are up there, if you can see them.
Great, thanks. I've got them now.
Look, if you forget those, I'm sure if you just email info@multilit.com, they will pass it over to us. So always happy to chat.
Great, thanks.
Anyone got any specific questions? I can see for a few of you some of those behaviour relatable. Hi, Nadia. How you going?
Hi, good, thanks. I'm a high school teacher. Are the workshops going to be focused primarily for primary?
So the videos that we took and I guess the examples we use are very much around primary school age children. And that really had a lot to do with also the kids that we had access to that we could rope into videoing. So I guess the examples and the discussion lies around primary school age children. However, we are talking here about the science of behaviour and functional behaviour assessment throughout the whole thing. And that is applicable to all age children, and it take a non-categorical approach as well. So it fits really well with, it doesn't matter about diagnosis or no diagnosis, it's just about if you're experiencing challenging behaviour and you want to learn how to look at it functionally, assess it and put plans in place, then it doesn't matter about the age.
And all the assessment tools and data sheets that come with the workshop are definitely applicable to high school. So we definitely were mindful of that the whole way through.
Brilliant. Yeah. Thank you so much. And one other question, the MultiLit literacy workshops, you actually need to be working at a school that subscribes to that. You can't just do it individually. Will it be the same for the positive behaviour?
Look, good. No, such a great question. For us, we really want everyone who's interested in learning about behaviour to come on board. So we've really pitched this towards teachers, but we've also really said, look, allied health, school counsellors, school psychologists, teachers who are working within a support class or a mainstream classroom. We might have, open door.
And individuals can book in as well. So not
okay. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Nadia.
Thanks.
Sorry, how much are the courses?
Look, I think best thing to do is maybe have a look at our website for that, because it's a sequence of courses. So the first one is classroom behaviour management at that sort of tier 1 level. And then this one that I guess relates to the topic today is the second course in the workshop. So probably best to have a look at the website, or it has a catalogue, so you can have a look through the catalogue as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Pleasure. Anyone else? We love chatting, so chat away.
I can see Simone here has made a really interesting comment that says, I feel like we spend longer at school documenting the behaviour than focusing on a replacement behaviour. And, that's a really great thing to recognise. I think sometimes we can get really stuck on, documenting incidents. An incident has occurred, I'm going to report on it. We get quite stuck on that tip of the iceberg about what the behaviour looks like. And we can really spend so much of our time teaching replacement behaviour, focusing on really motivating the student and reinforcing that behaviour. Ultimately, we want them to feel like it's much more worth their while to engage in this new great behaviour than engaging in the challenging behaviour. So essentially, we want to make the challenging behaviour less effective and the replacement behaviour highly effective. And that's how we create that change.
Just a note, the website is the first bullet point here. It's sort of a separate website to the main MultiLit website, and you can have a bit more info on the courses, and it has a few additional links. But if you're interested in knowing more about the workshop, you can express your interest on there as well.
I'm just looking at some more of the chat. I don't know if we've got time or not, or...
We have as much time as you would like.
Oh, excellent.
Okay, well, we could talk about this all night. So Vivian has made the comment that she has kids who flat out refuse to do any work or even engage when they don't want to do something. So if you're Vivian referring to a school environment, then we absolutely see a really common theme quite often of common function in a school environment is escaping or avoiding. And, one of the things that if we're getting an idea of the function, because you're talking about, avoiding doing any work that when they don't want to do something, when we more solidly know that that's the reason, then we need to start looking at things like the actual work. So we need to look at what kinds of modifications we might need to do. Is the work too demanding? Is it too... if there's certain skill deficits that are there that are making the work too difficult. And sometimes it might not necessarily be the academics itself. If say writing, for example, often, triggers this avoidance behaviour. Well, we need to work out what is aversive about writing to that student. Now, to some students, it could be, actually coming up with thoughts and ideas and putting them on paper is difficult. Some others, it could be actually pencil grip and holding the pencil. Could be sitting for extended periods of time, or it could be that I just simply don't want to do things that someone's told me to do, or I'd rather be out on the playground. But once we start to figure out what actually is it about that task that's triggering the avoidance, then we can start to look at task modification. We need to look at motivation systems. So, okay, this student really finds it hard to complete tasks. How do I motivate this particular student more in order to engage in those tasks? We might need to change the expectation of how much they might do and build up really, really gradually and slowly. It's a really systematic process.
Okay, thank you. I'm hoping to enroll in the course to learn more about motivating.
Awesome. Yes, motivation and teaching is definitely one of the courses coming up.
Yeah, I'm at a loss. I've got.
Okay, it's a really tough one, especially when you're just met with it constantly, and sometimes it can feel, impossible to kind of get over that hurdle of just flat out refusal. There are ways, there are sort of nifty little tricks and ways that we can do, and trying to determine an individual's preference is actually a skill set in itself. Just the common reinforcement systems that we might have in the classrooms, like the dojos or the merit certificates, for students who have significant challenging behaviour, that just might not cut it, and we need to be a little bit more individualised and systematic in how we actually motivate that particular child, especially when we're asking them to engage in something that's really hard.
Yeah, it's not always hard. It's just, it seems to be they just don't want to. They'd rather be cutting up pieces of paper or drawing.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to find something that can compete with that, which is tricky.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
No problem.
There's a scenario in the chat that
Yes.
Fran was talking about. Would you like to address that?
Is this with the child diagnosed, that one?
No, I have 2 students in my class who used to leave the room just to
Oh,
get.
yes. I saw that, and it's great. You looked at what could they do instead. Well, they could ask to leave the room, and you put that plan in place and you reinforce that. It's great that you saw positive change. Sometimes it's nice when it's something so simple, like, just got to teach them a more appropriate way to do that. I don't mind if they leave. They just got to ask, which is really good.
Absolutely. And to build on that point, that actual, Jill ended the webinar tonight on looking at those sort of critical or essential behaviours that sometimes we need to look at for children. And asking for permission is really a critical communication skill that some children need to be systematically taught. It's not something that they come to school with or at home that they engage in naturally. So asking for permission to go and get a drink versus just leaving the room whenever they want to is a perfect replacement behaviour. Sometimes we just don't think that some kids just need to learn that skill specifically.
Just got a little situation here with Sue about a student of hers who is doing even a NAPLAN environment, just constantly calling out, trying to get the teacher's attention, and sort of teachers sort of saying, I've tried everything, she has ADHD, I can't help it, this is what she's doing. And look, that's such a great example, isn't it, of that circular reasoning. Okay, so she has ADHD, that's why she's calling out, can't do much about that because that's part of the ADHD. So by doing that, she's sort of missing the opportunity to look at, okay, what's she doing? She's calling out. What's the function of that? Well, pretty quickly, we could probably hypothesize has something to do about her wanting to get attention. So why does she want to get attention? Does she find the work hard? Is she easily distracted? Would she rather talk to the teacher than actually do the work that she's asked to do? And how do we set the environment so she knows what's expected? She's motivated to stay on task, maybe even putting a system in place so she knows how many times perhaps within a given time period she could ask for teacher attention. So it's quite signaled, we're going to do this maths activity. It's going to take 15 minutes. I'm going to give you 3 opportunities to call out, and I'm going to respond to you the minute you call out, but it's just 3 opportunities. So it's kind of capped. Because what we do know about kids is if they're really persistent, they're pretty good at getting teachers' attention, because eventually you go, okay, stop. What is it that you want?
And not that we can give specific advice on situations that we haven't assessed or looked at ourselves, but to give you an example, in a really similar situation with a student that almost identical situation actually was constantly calling out, and it didn't matter what the context was. They weren't picking up on those sort of environmental cues that, oh, this is a testing situation now, or someone else is taking their turn, I've got to be quiet. We actually introduced a signalling system to that student. We've done it a lot at home with parents as well, who say, my child never knows that I can actually have a moment of peace and just a moment to myself. And so we use a signalling system where we might use a lanyard and when the lanyard's on green, it means that I'm available. So if you come over to me or you call up for my attention, I am available right then and there. And when it's on the other side where it might say shh, or it might say, do your work, this is the time where I'm not available. So if you do call out, I'm going to redirect you. We're going to carry on, and they get lots and lots of reinforcement when they call teacher when they're available. And then again, just like we were talking about with the student with the chasing game, we don't want to try and introduce this system and teach in the moment. It's impossible. We want to take a separate neutral time where we're specifically working on modelling and role-playing how this new system is going to be used. And that was effective for this particular child with learning when they can call that and when not to.
That's just an interesting point Micaela raised. And we always use that analogy of, if a child is drowning, it's not the best time to teach them how to swim. So when you're talking about looking at interventions, you obviously need to manage the situation when the child is having the challenging behaviour. You need to put, procedures in place to make sure they're safe, other people are safe, they're getting as little attention as possible. If the function was to get their attention, we try to minimise that attention as much as possible, kind of keep it quite neutral. But what we need to do is go, okay, so when they're ready to swim, do the swimming lesson or learn the intervention, that's where we put the strategies in place, and then we put it back into the real context. So that's something worth thinking about. And often we sort of walk into any family home, they're like, what do we do about this? And the child's having a big tantrum. We go, well, now's not the time I'm going to be showing you what to do about that. But we could definitely sort of try to minimise the risk at this point in time. Teaching happens outside of that.
Yeah, and I guess another point to think about is that we're not focusing, we're not trying to achieve turning behaviour off like a tap. So if our strategies tend to just turn that behaviour off straight away, it's quite possible that we're accidentally reinforcing that behaviour. We've done something that makes that behaviour go, yep, I don't need to do that anymore because I got what I want. What our strategies are after are looking for future reduction in behaviour. So it's not about in the moment, it's about next time and next time, that we want to see an overall reduction in frequency, duration, intensity over time. So it's not an immediate effect. And that's really important to think about for yourself, so you don't feel, I guess, disappointed if behaviours don't change immediately.
I love this comment here about a student they have in their class who has ADHD, and you give an example of, you always sort of give them a clear instruction of 2 before you, which sort of sets sort of really clear parameters that child can work with. Okay, 2 people before it's my turn. They learn that rule and they can kind of go, oh, it's going to happen. I've just got to allow 2 people to have a go first. I really like that. That's really clever. And another comment here about, putting strategies in place and then kind of behaviours becoming persistent and escalating. That's something that we see happening a lot when behaviour is looking for a certain outcome and the outcome's not being delivered. Well, behaviours often escalate, going, hold on a minute, what do I need to do here? Do I need to whinge a bit more? Do I need to be more disruptive? What do I need to do to get the outcome I'm looking for? So sometimes behaviours escalating is because they're trying to get the outcome, but they're not being successful. That is part of the journey of behaviour change.
And that's why you do need to be making sure you've got supports in place before you implement a plan, because number one, we don't want things to escalate to a dangerous level. We need to make sure that it's not that sort of behaviour. And also we want to make sure that you've got kind of backup and support so that you feel confident to continue implementing the plan consistently. So Simone's asked, do you have any ideas to support a teacher in the moment when they are feeling overwhelmed while they wait for the times it takes to implement the plan? That's a really good question. And so I think, Simone, what you're saying is that while you're waiting for a plan to be developed and implemented, the teacher might be feeling overwhelmed about what to do. I would say I completely empathise, because sometimes, again, if we're looking at that meaningful and lasting change approach, we can't just whip up a plan in the moment. We need to kind of do our thinking about maintaining function and looking at deficits and developing our plan. The things that we can do are continuing to take some data. So, if you know how to do ABC data collection, because the more information we gather, the more information we have to work with. I would also say, when in doubt, be neutral. So try to remain as neutral as possible while still ensuring safety first. But you know, we can engage in ways that sort of limit bringing in additional things when we don't really know what's going on, because we can accidentally strengthen behaviour when we do that.
The other two things you can do is putting preventative strategies in place really early on. You can probably start that happening, because even if you're not exactly sure what the function of the behaviour is, you could probably start getting a bit of a clue about what triggers are, and can you make some changes to those antecedents and triggers. So you could probably start there. The other thing that I think is really powerful is saying to teachers, we can start looking at reinforcement early on. We can start assessing their preferences early on. We can start looking at trying to see what the child is interested in, build more play into the session with them, build a bit more of a rapport with them, but start looking at what gets them going. What are they excited about? Because by doing that investigation, it's going to help you sort of feed into your reinforcement plan. So really spending time sort of exploring their interests, which we might call a preference assessment, is something you could start straight away. Yeah. Yes, you're right. We really would love to see learning and support teams as well as teachers doing these workshops. And, you know, I worked with incredible learning and support teachers over the years who often have a wealth of knowledge and experience because they've had such an amount of practical time in the classrooms. But what they're missing is actually some of the training. So if we can upskill them, can you imagine what they would be like in your classroom? Also, it's often these people that spend the one-on-one time with that student in the classroom. So even more reason why we should upskill them. Excellent. Yeah, good point. All right, I think we might sort of close it off. But as we said, send us an email. Happy to chat to you. And if you're interested in sort of diving down and building your capacity to do functional behaviour assessment, we've got you covered at MultiLit. So give us a call.
That definitely to be perhaps the end of the questions for now. I'd just like to say thank you, Jill and Micaela, for such a highly informative, highly useful, practical presentation. It was very, very popular with the audience tonight. I think the key point for me was that alongside the science of reading and the science of learning, when you apply the science of behavior to teaching, you just get this overall more and more positive picture. So thank you for bringing that to us tonight, and we look forward to seeing the rest of your work and what MultiLit has in store along those lines. Thank you everyone for coming, and it will be lovely to see you all again during the next event, which I don't have off the top of my head because I'm a stand-in. But I'll bid everybody a good night. Thanks again, Jill and Micaela. Thanks, everyone.